Under the dim glow of a busted streetlight, a young boy stepped out slow from a beat-up car, hoodie hanging low, hand down by his side, fingers curled around a pistol that looked too big for his skinny frame. Up the street, a group of older boys spread out, one holding a bat, another reaching under his hoodie. The kid didn't flinch. He said it clear. "Y'all better get back in that car." But they didn't. 2 shots rang out, one of them screamed, and the others dipped. That was the night Don got a name, but the game had already been calling him. Thing is, what happened on that street wasn't no accident, and it sure didn't start there. If you really want to understand how a 14-year-old ends up with a body count, you got to rewind the whole tape all the way back to where the fire started. Don Vu was born in 1977, right in the middle of a country that barely made the news, even when bombs were lighting up the skies like fireworks gone wrong. Laos wasn't supposed to be part of the war, but the US was running a secret operation there, flying in B-52s and dumping more than 2 million tons of bombs on small villages, rice fields, and forest trails. To this day, Laos still holds the title for the most bombed country per capita in world history. That wasn't some throwaway stat. That's the kind of legacy that gets burned into a bloodline. Don's family was from the highlands, regular folks trying to stay alive while American planes lit up the hills and communist fighters moved through the trees. His pops had seen things, but like most Lao men back then, he didn't talk much about it. Survival came first. In 1983, when Don was 6, they packed what little they had and made a break for it. Crossed the Mekong River, ducked patrols, and landed in a Thai refugee camp, dirty, hungry, and lucky to still be breathing. They stayed there for a while, doing what every other refugee family did, waiting. Some waited for weeks, others for years. Don's family waited just long enough to get a one-way ticket to the States, part of a U.S. resettlement program that flew out Southeast Asian refugees by the thousands, but gave barely any guidance on what came next. When they touched down in Minnesota, it wasn't no dream. The airport was cold, the people stared, and the snow on the ground was something Don had never seen before. They didn't go to some cozy house with a welcome mat either. They were placed in public housing in North Minneapolis, on the kind of block where buildings leaned sideways, windows stayed boarded up, and gunshots came with the weather. Don's family was the first Asian household in that particular project, dropped into a neighborhood already dealing with poverty, drugs, and decades of racial tension. Everything about life in North Minneapolis hit hard. The cold, the food, the language, the way folks looked at them sideways like they didn't belong. For Don, every day felt like entering enemy territory. The people didn't know how to deal with a kid who couldn't speak English yet, and the other weren't exactly welcoming either. He got picked on for his accent, for smelling like fish sauce, for rocking hand-me-downs that didn't match. It didn't take long for the kid to realize if you do not fight, you will eventually fold. So Don fought, sometimes with words, sometimes with fists. And slowly he started learning how to move in the space. The black kids on the block saw he had heart, so they brought him in, started letting him hoop with them, letting him walk home in their group so he wouldn't get jumped. In time, he wasn't just the new Asian kid anymore. He was part of the mix. He started picking up the slang, rapping along to NWA and DJ Quick, breakdancing on cardboard outside the rec center. This was the mid-'80s when hip-hop was still bubbling underground, raw and rebellious. For a kid who came from bomb craters and refugee lines, hearing Ice Cube talk about survival and street codes felt like someone had finally put words to what he couldn't say himself. But for every good memory, there was always a darker one waiting around the corner. Don might have found a new crew, but the city still saw him as foreign, still treated his family like outsiders. They got jumped in the parking lots. Their apartment got robbed more than once. Don watched his mom cry over missing rent, watched his dad work himself sick trying to provide for a family that barely had enough. The housing projects had their own rhythm. Mamas yelling through cracked windows, basketballs bouncing off metal rims, the constant hum of arguments and old TVs. But underneath all that noise, you could feel the pressure building. Gangs were starting to form. Some black sets already had a hold on the blocks, but there were whispers of Asian kids organizing too. Hmong kids, Lao kids, and Cambodian kids. Kids who were tired of getting jumped and tired of being looked at like they didn't have any backup. Back when Don was just a kid walking through Willard Elementary in North Minneapolis, he didn't talk much, mostly kept his head down. Not because he was shy, but because when you barely speak the language and everybody looking at you like you a zoo exhibit, silence feels safer than trying to explain yourself. The schoolyard wasn't no escape either. It was the main battlefield where kids tested each other, tossed jokes that cut deep, and grouped up fast around lines you didn't even know existed. Don stood out in all the wrong ways. He was Lao. He wore hand-me-downs that didn't fit, and he smelled like the food his mom cooked, fish sauce and jasmine rice, which the other kids clowned him for. It started with jokes and shoves, but it didn't take long before it turned into getting jumped behind the portable classrooms or being followed home by older boys with nothing better to do than make the foreign kid flinch. He tried to hold his own with his fists, but the odds never leaned in his favor, so he learned quick that size didn't matter if your heart was big enough to swing first. That's when the fights started stacking up. Teachers labeled him a problem, but they never asked why he was always swinging. He wasn't trying to be hard, he was just trying not to be prey. At 12 years old, Don made a decision that most kids don't even think about until they way older. He started carrying a small pistol. Nothing flashy, just a little something he could tuck into his waistband or in his coat pocket, just in case somebody tried to test him again. It wasn't about being a shooter or trying to scare folks off the block. It was about walking to school without having to look over his shoulder the whole way. By then, Don was already in middle school, posted up near the North Commons Park after school, hanging with kids who also had chips on their shoulders and something to prove. Some were black, some were Latino, a few were Hmong or Vietnamese, but most were like Don in one key way. They didn't feel like they belonged anywhere, so they carved out their own space wherever they could. The mid-'80s in Minneapolis came with its own soundtrack, and Don was living right in the middle of it. He used to run home and flip open his cassette player to blast LL Cool J, DJ Quick, or Eazy-E, the volume turned up just loud enough to drown out whatever noise was happening in the apartment upstairs. NWA hit him different though, especially when Ice Cube said something raw, like, "Life ain't nothing but bitches and money." Because even though Don didn't know all the words at first, the anger in their voices sounded like something that had been stuck inside him for years. Hip-hop gave him language, not just English, but emotion, style, attitude, and a way to stand tall when he wanted to disappear. It was more than music. It was a mirror that finally showed him something familiar, something that made sense. He started rapping along, mimicking flows, even trying to write a few bars when nobody was looking. Music gave him peace, but the streets kept pulling him deeper. It was around this time that Don started noticing how some of the older kids moved differently. They walked like they owned the sidewalk, rolled in tight packs, and didn't flinch when cops drove by. They wore Bulls jackets, red bandanas folded just right, and they always had something slick to say. Don watched them like a student watching a teacher, taking mental notes on how to survive without looking scared. What drew Don in wasn't the violence or the colors, it was the protection. The sense that if you rocked with the right crew, you wouldn't have to fight alone. The gang culture in North Minneapolis wasn't as organized as what was happening in South Central or Chicago, but it was there, low-key but real, and Asian kids were starting to form their own thing too. The idea that a group of Lao and Hmong teens could squat up and make their own names started out quiet, but it was growing louder every month. Before any gang names were written in graffiti or whispered by cops, there was just this small circle of kids like Don, hanging out by the basketball courts or behind corner stores, trying to figure out how to stop being targets. And even though they weren't flashing signs or throwing up letters yet, the bond was forming. If one got jumped, all of them pulled up. That was the code, even before it had a name. Don still tried to keep things separate. At home, he played the role of the oldest son, helping his mom clean up after dinner, translating mail, and watching over his younger siblings. But once he stepped outside, he was no longer just Don Vu from apartment 302. He was the kid who didn't hesitate to swing first, who carried heat even when the snow was knee-deep, and who didn't back down when somebody twice his size tried to test him. Looking back, it wasn't just one fight or one moment that turned Don into who he was becoming. It was the slow build of being called chink in the hallway, of teachers letting other kids cheat off him because he's smart anyway, of cops staring him down when he was just walking to the corner store. All those little cuts added up, and Don stitched them together with pride, aggression, and the belief that if he didn't defend himself, nobody else would. By the time he turned 13, he was already known in his circle as someone you didn't want to mess with. His name started floating through North High School before he even stepped foot in it. And not because he was smart or athletic, but because people heard he shot at two dudes who tried to rush him. That part of the story, the shots, the chase, the silence after, that's still coming. But just know, by that point, childhood was already gone. It didn't slip away. It got stomped out brick by brick, fight by fight, until there was nothing left but survival. By the time Don hit 14, the streets around Plymouth Avenue and North Commons Park had already become something way deeper than just the place you kicked it after school. It was where bonds got tested, where crews formed, and where kids who used to walk solo started moving in packs. There was this shift happening right under everybody's nose, And if you weren't paying attention, you would have missed how fast them Lao and Hmong kids started organizing. Back then, North Minneapolis was mostly black, and that side of the city already had its fair share of street politics. Vice lords, gangster disciples, and a few smaller sets were already laying down turf, repping blocks and pushing the kind of code where respect meant survival. The Asian kids, though, were new to the game, and for a while they stayed on the sidelines, moving quiet, heads low, trying to avoid catching heat they couldn't handle. But the thing about staying quiet in a loud city is, eventually you get tested anyway, and when that kept happening to Don and his circle, they decided being quiet wasn't the move no more. What started with a few Laotian teens from the north side turned into something real, when they linked up with some Hmong boys who had been through the same grind, bullied, jumped, robbed, and constantly having to explain where they were from, like that gave folks the right to put hands on them. So they gave themselves a name, the Lao Boys. It wasn't nothing official at first, just something they said when folks asked who they ran with, but that name started catching on quick in the parks, in the schools, and in the streets. These were refugee kids who had seen war before they learned English, and now they were building their own unit to survive a new kind of battlefield. Most of them were still in their teens, barely old enough to drive, but already moving like grown men. Don, who everybody knew had already let off shots and walked away clean, became a name people dropped in hushed tones, especially after word got out that he was officially jumped in. It happened in 1991, right behind the North Commons Park Rec Center, under that busted street lamp that never got fixed. His own homies lined up, one after the other, giving him the work for 30 long seconds, just enough to prove he could take pain without folding. When it was over, Don didn't smile or say much, just dabbed his face with his sleeve, nodded once, and said, "We good." After that, he was fully in, and there wasn't no backing out. No halfway stepping, and no asking why things needed to be done a certain way. He started rolling with the OGs of the crew, older cats like Vang, nicknamed Fatty, and a dude named Sang, who always had a .22 on him and smoked Newports like they was vitamins. These were the ones who knew how to move through alleys, how to spot an unmarked car from 2 blocks away, and how to press somebody without saying a word. The Lao Boys didn't have fancy colors at first, but they did rock a uniform of sorts. Red bandanas tucked into pockets, bull snapbacks turned just slightly off center, and hoodies with the sleeves rolled high enough to show off the burn marks, tattoos, or whatever story you had etched into your skin. They wasn't claiming blood outright, not yet, but the signs were there. The color, the attitude, and the codes they followed. They posted heavy around Plymouth Avenue, mostly near North Commons and a few side blocks like Penn and Logan, claiming space not through drive-bys or wild headlines, but through presence, through showing up deep, through making it known they weren't going to be pushed around like the generation before them. That park became theirs not because they took it by force, but because they defended it every time somebody tried to take it from them. And retaliation was never far off. If one of theirs got jumped, they pulled up that same night. If someone talked slick in school, they waited in the parking lot. They moved fast, not because they were trying to be flashy, but because they understood that hesitation in the streets gets you hurt or worse. Word started traveling quick through the city. School resource officers at North High and Henry started flagging certain kids for wearing too much red or sitting in groups too tight. By late 1992, Don's name had landed in the Minneapolis PD gang unit's internal database, one of the first Laotian names they ever logged. They didn't even know what they were looking at back then, just scribbled notes saying, possible Asian set, hangs near park, often seen with Hmong boys. Minneapolis cops wasn't used to seeing Asian gangs moving like that. They were used to old-school Chinatown tongs or Vietnamese crews from the coast, not these second-generation refugees who had more in common with Southside Bloods than some triad operation. These kids didn't do extortion or gambling rackets. They fought over respect, over loyalty, over stupid beefs that could have been squashed if someone had just apologized first, but nobody was going to be the one to blink. The Lao Boys rode mostly in stolen Civics or old Cutlasses, music bumping, heads on a swivel, always posted at the corners of Penn and Plymouth, or sometimes deeper west near Olson Memorial. They knew which side streets had loose cameras, which alley gates didn't lock, and which garages you could dip into if things got hot. They had a network, small but sharp, and Don was at the heart of it. The funny thing is, they weren't even into heavy dope selling back then. Yeah, some of them moved weed or a little meth, but mostly it was about showing out, being seen, proving that their crew was real, and making sure nobody forgot who ran the Northside corners. Don was one of the loudest in terms of actions, not words. He didn't do a lot of talking, but if you disrespected somebody from his circle, you better be ready to handle whatever came next. By 1993, the name Lao Boys was no longer just playground talk. It was showing up in police reports, in gang strategy meetings, and even on walls tagged in red near Broadway and Bryant. Older Asian heads who had tried to keep quiet were now having to answer for what their kids were doing, and Hmong pastors started having late-night meetings trying to figure out how to steer the youth back to something more productive. But for Don and his crew, the path was already laid. They didn't see themselves as troublemakers. They saw themselves as protectors, as survivors, as the ones who finally stopped getting slapped around and started slapping back. Every fight they took, every punch they threw, every night they stood 10 deep by the rec center was them sending a message. The Lao Boys didn't flinch, didn't fold, and definitely didn't forget. They moved with structure, had runners, lookouts, and peacemakers, and even though they didn't say it outright, everyone knew Don was rising fast in the ranks. He had the kind of loyalty you don't buy. He earned it by showing up when it counted, by putting his body on the line, and by never letting anybody from the crew walk into a fight alone. That was the beginning of what would later turn into something way more serious, but right here, in this moment, in the early 90s, it was still just about proving that they mattered, that their struggle wasn't invisible, and that if nobody was going to protect them, they were damn sure going to protect each other. By the time Don turned 16, his face was already known around Plymouth Avenue. His name already carried weight near Logan and Penn. And when folks saw him walking, they didn't call out. They just watched, quiet. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy, but the way he moved said enough. Calm steps, eyes always scanning, and a grip that stayed close to the waistband of his oversized jeans. He didn't walk like he had something to prove. He walked like he knew something you didn't. That summer, 1993, the streets of North Minneapolis were restless, and the heat wasn't just coming from the weather. Tension had been building between crews, not over turf exactly, but over pride, disrespect, and that old familiar itch to show who held more power. Don had been dealing with whispers for weeks. Talk that some fools from the east side had been throwing shade on his name, saying he was soft, saying he only pulled his piece but never let it ring. He ignored it at first because where he's from, reacting too quick gets you set up, but eventually some words come with action built in. The night it happened, Don wasn't even looking for trouble. He was riding in a beat-up Honda with one of his closest homies, heading toward the park where they usually linked up with the rest of the crew. They were supposed to meet at Farview Park, just a few blocks north of Broadway, not far from the corner store where Don used to grab now and laters, and a Faygo Red Pop back when life was simpler. But that night wasn't about candy and soda. That night had a different vibe. A car started trailing them about 3 blocks from the park. Don clocked it in the side mirror, kept his cool, didn't say much, just told his boy to turn down a side street. The other car followed. When they hit the stop sign by 26th and Lindale, the car behind gassed up and pulled next to them. Don looked over, saw 2 faces he recognized, dudes he had seen around but never dealt with directly. One of them was holding a bat in his lap, tapping it like he was warming up for something. They followed Don's car for a few more blocks, then both cars pulled over. Don stepped out first. He wasn't looking to start anything, but he wasn't about to back down either. He had that thing tucked, and he wasn't afraid to use it if he had to. The 2 rivals got out slow, one holding the bat, the other with his hands in his hoodie pocket, looking like he was ready to swing. Don said he kept it real calm at first. He looked them in the eye and said, "Y'all got a problem?" No yelling, no flexing, just letting them know he wasn't in the mood for games. They said yeah, they did. Then they started fanning out like they was gonna rush him. That's when Don stepped back, lifted his shirt, pulled the .38 from his waistband, and told them to back up. They didn't, so he squeezed the trigger once and then twice. One of them dropped to the ground, yelling and grabbing his leg. The other dipped back into the car and peeled off down the block. Don stood there for a second, gun still in his hand, watching the dude on the ground squirm. Then he turned around, got back in his car, and told his boy to drive. Later on, when Don talked about it, he said he didn't shoot to kill. He said he aimed low on purpose, that he just wanted to scare them, let them know he wasn't the one to play with. "If I was trying to take somebody out, I would have aimed higher," he said. "I pointed at the ground. I just wanted to send a message." But the cops didn't see it that way. By the next day, his name was already on a police report, and by the end of the week, they had him in cuffs. He got hit with 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder, plus a weapons charge and reckless discharge. It wasn't looking good. Prosecutors were trying to make an example out of him, paint him as some cold-blooded gang shooter who didn't care about life. The media wasn't really paying attention, but in the North Side, everybody was watching. Don sat in juvie for 2 weeks while his family scraped together the money for a lawyer, somebody who understood how to talk to a judge without making Don look like a villain. The public defender didn't cut it, so they found a private attorney named Carl Hennepin, a slick-talking Vietnamese lawyer who had handled some cases for Asian kids before. He said Don didn't need to say a word, just let him work. When the court date came, everything hinged on the victims, but one of them, the dude who got shot, never showed up. The other came in once, then disappeared. No cooperation, no testimony, no faces for the jury to see. Don's lawyer argued it was self-defense, said the kid was scared for his life, said Don had every right to protect himself from two older boys who came at him with a bat. The judge, an older white man named Harold Donnelly, didn't look impressed, but when the prosecution couldn't produce a witness, the charges started to fall apart. The murder counts got dropped, the weapons charge stuck, and Don ended up pleading guilty to firing a weapon within city limits. His sentence? 3 months house arrest, 5 years probation, no more weapons, regular check-ins, and a long list of things he wasn't supposed to do. But on the block, nobody cared about the paperwork. All they saw was a 16-year-old who pulled the trigger, caught a case, and walked out the front door. From that moment on, Don wasn't just another kid from the north side with a past. He was a name you didn't mention too loud unless you were ready for whatever came next. The little kid who used to get bullied in 5th grade was now a shooter with a story. And whether the details were right or not, the streets had already decided who he was. When he showed up at North Commons again, red bandana in his pocket, fitted cap tilted just enough, everybody noticed. The younger kids wanted to be around him, the older ones wanted to test him, and the ones who knew better just gave him a nod and kept it moving. He didn't brag, he didn't boast, but he didn't move like a regular teenager either. He had tasted what it meant to pull that trigger, to sit in his cell wondering what his future looked like, and then to walk back out with the whole neighborhood watching. It changed something in him, hardened him in ways that didn't show up on the outside but lived deep under his skin. That shooting, them 2 shots on a quiet street near the park, would follow Don forever. It was the kind of moment that splits your life in half, turns you from someone into something, and even if the city forgot, even if the cops cleared the file, the people who were there that night never forgot. And Don, he remembered every single second of it. That's the night the Lao Boys went from being a crew of kids looking for protection to being seen as real players in the street game. And Don, whether he wanted it or not, became the proof that they weren't just fronting. They were ready to go all the way if they had to. By the mid-90s, the streets of North Minneapolis had turned into something way different from what Don first grew up in. What used to be scattered crews and unofficial cliques had now evolved into full-on street armies with names, codes, colors, and reputations that bled out beyond just Plymouth Avenue. The Lao Boys, once just a circle of neighborhood kids trying to protect each other, had stamped their presence so loud other crews started forming up just to counter them. It wasn't just Black and Latino sets dominating the map anymore. By 1995, Southeast Asian gangs were not only on the radar, they were ringing alarms, especially across the Twin Cities. The cops started using new acronyms: LCB, RVP, TRG, MPK, CWA. Most folks on the block didn't know what those letters stood for, but the kids who lived in it knew all too well. Lao Boys, Rondo Village Posse, Tiny Rascals Gang, Menace of Peace Crew, Crazy White Asians. And behind every one of those names, there were real sets, real beefs, and real funerals. Inside the Lao community, things got real personal, real quick. Not every Lao teen saw eye to eye with Don's crew. Some thought the original Lao Boys had gotten too cocky, too violent, too reckless. Others just wanted their own lane, their own voice, and started peeling off to form their own sets. That's how the Lao Boys came to life, a hard-headed breakaway faction that used to be part of the same movement, same origin, now moving different. The LCB didn't just want a seat at the table, they wanted to flip the whole thing. They tagged up new spots, repped hard around the Marshall Terrace and Columbia Heights side, and let it be known they weren't rolling with Don and his people no more. To outsiders, it probably looked like petty drama between Asian kids trying to mimic West Coast gang culture, but on the block, it felt deadly real. Things started going sideways at places that used to feel safe, like school cafeterias, house parties, and especially the annual Hmong New Year celebration, which brought together thousands of families across the Midwest. What should have been a cultural moment of pride started turning into a battlefield, with crews posturing in the parking lot, flexing in designer coats, and throwing signs behind dark sunglasses. In 1996, one of the biggest brawls broke out during the St. Paul Hmong New Year Festival, right outside River Center. Nobody got shot, but multiple people ended up in the hospital with cracked ribs, busted lips, and stab wounds. Don wasn't there that night, but his name got dragged into it anyway. The newspapers barely covered it, but the streets kept the story alive for months. North High School and Patrick Henry started resembling more like pressure cookers than schools. Kids came in strapped with blades tucked in their boots, waiting for lunch period to catch their ops slipping. Teachers kept turning blind eyes, not because they didn't care, but because they had no idea what was really going on. The administration didn't understand Lao, Hmong, or street lingo, and by the time they caught up, the damage had already been done. Don tried to keep the focus on his block, tried not to get caught up in every rumor or ego contest, but it was like trying to sweep water off the sidewalk. Every new set that popped up meant more drama, more risk, and less room for peace. It wasn't just about protecting your crew anymore. It was about making sure your name didn't get disrespected, even if it was by somebody you once called brother. Still, he stayed loyal to his set. He never flipped, never switched up, never tried to act like he was bigger than the streets that raised him. Even when some of his closest day ones started showing up wearing different colors, posting up with rival cliques, Don kept repping the original crew. To him, it wasn't just a name or a color, it was history. It was every fight, every scar, every moment when they stood shoulder to shoulder with nothing but fists and fear holding them together. Around this time, the police presence started doubling up. Cops were hitting the neighborhoods with gang unit vans, taking Polaroids of teenagers in the park, writing names down in gang databases that didn't have any real oversight. If you got caught walking with the wrong group of boys, if your name came up in somebody else's paperwork, if your face showed up too many times on surveillance, they slapped a gang affiliation tag on you that followed you everywhere, to court, to school, even to job interviews. Don got listed early, his name showing up in a 1996 MPD gang report alongside 6 others, all labeled Lao Boys, primary actors, highly active, considered armed. That was all it took to get labeled for life. It didn't matter if you stepped away from the scene, didn't matter if you were just standing on your porch. Once you were in that database, everything you did looked criminal. Even the OGs started getting nervous. Older cats who used to roll with Don's crew began talking about moving out, laying low, maybe taking jobs in the suburbs. A few got locked up on old warrants or drug charges, and when they came back out, they barely recognized the block. It wasn't just North versus South anymore. Now it was Lao versus Lao, Hmong versus Hmong, even sometimes neighborhood versus neighborhood within the same crew. One time, after a Lao Boys member got stabbed at a bus stop near Broadway and Emerson, retaliation came fast. A kid from LCB got jumped 2 days later, left laid out in front of a laundromat with broken ribs and a busted eye socket. Don wasn't there, but everybody assumed he gave the green light. Truth was, he didn't have to. The code was already written. Through all this, Don kept doing what he always did, moving low, keeping his circle tight, never letting outsiders into his personal world. He still visited his family on the weekends, still helped his little sister with homework, still checked on his moms to make sure she had groceries. But when he stepped back out, when the bandana went in the pocket and the hoodie came up, it was like flipping a switch. To outsiders, Don looked like every other street kid trying to play gangster. But to the north side, he was the one who had earned every stripe, every story, every whisper. He wasn't loud with it, didn't post up on corners for attention, but people knew. And in the middle of a scene that was falling apart piece by piece, that kind of steadiness made him different. Don saw what was happening to his city. He saw the splintering, the wasted lives, the funerals that kept getting younger. He saw brothers turning into strangers, best friends becoming enemies. And while part of him wanted to pull back, to walk away before the fire swallowed everything, another part of him just couldn't. Because even when the gang world started fracturing, even when it all felt unstable, his loyalty to the Lao Boys stayed locked in. The fall of 1995 rolled in colder than expected, even for Minneapolis. The trees had already dropped most of their leaves. The streets were damp with that mix of early frost and busted fire hydrants, and everybody who moved in them knew tension was thick in the air. Don had been laying low for a minute, letting the static from the summer cool down, but one invitation pulled him back outside. A Hmong wedding celebration set for the last weekend of October. This one had buzz, the kind that rippled through Southeast Asian communities in the Twin Cities like heat through blacktop. Folks from all over were pulling up. Not just family, but people from all kinds of crews. Cousins who used to roll tight with the Lao Boys, plus cats from the Crimino side, and even some from rival Hmong sets. For Don, showing up wasn't about causing no drama. It was about respect. He knew the groom from back in the day, so he threw on a button-up, laced-up clean kicks and stepped in with two of his boys. The spot was packed. A community center on the east side of St. Paul, humming with that mix of traditional music and low murmurs of unfinished beef. The elders were lined up by the buffet tables, sipping tea and stacking styrofoam plates, but the younger crowd were different. They were posted up in corners, whispering, mean mugging, watching every move like it was a chessboard. Don kept to himself, nodding at a few familiar faces, posted up near the back with a view of the exits. He could feel the stares, feel the way the room shifted when he moved. Maybe it was because folks hadn't seen him in a while. Maybe it was because he still held weight without saying a word. Or maybe it was just the fact that the Lao Boys name still rang out loud, even in rooms where it wasn't welcome. It only took one wrong look to flip the vibe. One of the LCB dudes bumped into Don's boy, didn't apologize, just kept walking. Words got exchanged. Nothing loud, nothing crazy, but the kind of words that stack up like dry leaves, just waiting for a match. 10 minutes later, it popped off. Nobody really knows who threw the first punch. Some said it was a misunderstanding. Others swore it was a setup, but by the time fists started flying, chairs were flipping, drinks were spilling, and plates were crashing to the floor. The DJ cut the music, aunties screamed, kids got pulled behind tables, and in the middle of all that chaos, somebody pulled. 3 shots cracked through the celebration. It wasn't clear who got hit right away, only that people scattered like roaches under light. Don dropped low behind a pillar, scanning for his boys, making sure nobody was laid out. In the aftermath, 2 men were found with wounds to the leg and one with a graze to the shoulder. None of them died, but the message was loud. This wasn't just street beef anymore, it was spilling into family spaces, weddings, traditions, the parts of the culture meant to bring peace. Don didn't get caught at the scene, but he wasn't exactly hard to find either. A week later, police knocked on his mom's door with a warrant in hand. They picked him up in front of his little sister, cuffed him without a fight, and drove him to Ramsey County Jail like he was public enemy number 1. His name hit the local paper that week, not front page, but deep enough to make waves in the community. The headline was simple: 3 shot at Hmong wedding, teen arrested. Beneath it, a small write-up that painted Don as a known gang figure, involved in multiple altercations, now charged in connection with a violent outburst at what should have been a peaceful cultural event. Bail got set at $10,000, a number way too high for a teenager with no real job, and a mom working double shifts just to keep food on the table. His boys tried to raise something, pulled together a few hundred, but it wasn't enough. Don sat in county for weeks, then months, waiting for a trial date that kept getting pushed back. Inside, it was a whole different kind of test. County wasn't like the block. There were no corners to dip behind, no houses to retreat to when things got too hot. Everything was under bright lights, behind locked doors, with dudes from every crew and sets staring you down during meal lines. Don kept his head up, moved smart, and never let anyone catch him slipping. He got lucky with his cellmate, a dude named Mikey Tone, who used to rap back in the late 80s, one of those underground types who never popped mainstream but had bars for days. Mikey was from Chicago, doing time on some parole violation, and spent most nights scribbling verses on toilet paper rolls with a pencil stub. At first, Don just listened, but eventually he started joining in, tossing lines, trading rhymes, finding rhythm in the middle of metal beds and cold walls. He didn't think of it as a career move, just something to do to keep his mind off court dates and chow trays, but Mikey saw something in him, told him his pain had tone, said his voice held weight, said the streets needed more than shooters, they needed storytellers. Meanwhile, the case on the outside was falling apart. The 3 victims who got hit at the wedding didn't want to testify. One disappeared to California, another claimed he didn't remember much, and the third stopped answering calls. Without their cooperation, the DA didn't have much to stand on. They offered Don a plea, take 5 months in county, walk out on 2 years parole. His lawyer didn't sugarcoat it. It was the best deal he was going to get. Don took it, figuring 5 months was a small price to pay for walking free again, even if he had to be on papers after. He signed the plea on a Thursday morning, got processed for release a week later, and walked out just before Christmas, skinny, tired, but sharper than ever. On the outside, the streets hadn't changed much, but the way people looked at Don had. He wasn't just that loud kid who held his own anymore. He was the one who took heat at a wedding, sat down in county, and came back standing. Some folks respected that, others feared it, but nobody ignored it. What stuck with Don more than anything, though, wasn't the headlines or the court dates. It was those late nights trading verses in a jail cell. For the first time in a long while, he felt like his story had shape, like maybe all that pain could be flipped into something worth hearing. Still, parole meant he had to move careful. No slip-ups, no fresh charges, no being caught in the wrong place with the wrong people. But Don was Don. Even on papers, he still pulled up to the park, still checked in with the crew, still walked through the block like his name mattered. The wedding had changed things, sure, but it hadn't slowed him down. If anything, it made the path forward even clearer. He had survived beef, shots, courtrooms, and cells. Now, his name wasn't just feared, it was certified. The streets knew it, the cops knew it, and deep down Don knew it too. By the time Don stepped out from behind bars, the game had already started changing. It wasn't just the gangland politics anymore. The city was shifting, the energy was different, and a new lane was opening up that didn't require you to keep a piece in your waistband or watch your back every block. That's when Don started moving different, and that's when Gumby was born. He kept the name low-key at first, something only the inner circle used, a nickname that came from back when he used to bend and bounce back from every hit the streets threw at him. But once the bars started coming together and the beats matched the mood, Gumby became more than a nickname, it became his voice. He linked up with a few trusted cats and formed Lao Felons, a rap crew that held weight beyond their name. These weren't just aspiring rappers or dudes playing dress-up. These were street soldiers with real charges, real scars, and real stories to tell. They weren't out to chase radio spins or BET placements. They were speaking directly to the community that raised them, the ones who knew the difference between a verse and a statement. In 1998, they dropped their first underground album, Fast Life. They pressed the CDs themselves, burned them out of basements and bedrooms, sold them hand-to-hand at shows, corner stores, and barbershops. They moved 8,000 copies without a label, without a manager, without airplay, just real talk and street support. Every verse was laced with history, every hook built on memories of smoke-filled parks, squad cars, and lost homies. The album caught ears beyond the North Side. Word spread quick in the Asian rap underground, from the Bay to the Bronx. And when MC Jin came through town on tour, Gumby opened up for him, stepping on stage with the same energy he once brought to street corners. This time, though, the mic was his weapon. The lyrics weren't about fantasy or clout. They were detailed playbacks of what life really felt like when you didn't know if you'd see 21, when your crew felt more like family than the one at home, and when survival was your only plan. Gumby rapped about the funerals, the fades, the food stamps, the cold nights when the heater didn't work, and neither did your alibi. People started listening, not just for the beats, but for the weight behind the words. And in rooms full of kids who looked like him, who grew up between cultures, who never saw themselves in the mainstream rap, Gumby became something different. He wasn't trying to be anybody else. He was just telling the truth, and in that truth, he found an audience that had been quiet for too long. As Gumby rose through the underground, the set that made him started to fade. The Lao Boys name still carried respect, but the streets had changed by the early 2000s. Minneapolis police weren't playing anymore. Gang task forces hit hard, kicking in doors, dropping injunctions, labeling Southeast Asian cliques as high-priority targets. By the time new crews started making noise, the Minneapolis scene was already stretched thin. New crews like MOD in Fresno, TRG in Orange County, and ORB in Milwaukee have taken over. Some Lao Boys flipped sets, some went quiet, and others ended up buried or caged. But Gumby, he took a different turn. He started pulling back from the block, not because he was scared, but because the music gave him a reason to build instead of just survive. He began showing up at schools, talking to kids who were walking the same tightrope he did, trying to figure out how to stay out the system while still feeling like they belonged somewhere. He never preached, never came with that just say no energy, because he knew firsthand that life don't move in straight lines. Instead, he shared stories. He showed them how every choice had a domino effect, how one bad night could rewrite your whole future, how pain could be flipped into purpose if you had the voice to speak it. That shift opened new doors. A local filmmaker tapped him for a small role in a short film about refugee life and gang violence. His scene wasn't long, just a 2-minute monologue in a halfway house, but the emotion hit different. Directors started calling. More roles followed, mostly indie, always gritty, always grounded in real life. Now when Don walked through the neighborhood, people still nodded, still showed love, but it wasn't just about fear or respect anymore. It was about what he represented. A way out that didn't mean turning your back on where you came from. To this day, Gumby's name still rings in the Asian American rap archives. And in North Minneapolis, where cold winters built hard kids and harder choices, his legacy never left the block. The set might have faded, but the lessons, the voice, the truth he carried stayed loud long after the gunshots stopped echoing. By 2002, things had calmed down on the surface, but for Don, that didn't mean peace. He had lived too fast, too hard, for too long. The bullets didn't always hit him, but the stress did. There was weight behind his eyes, the kind that don't show up in mugshots, but lingers in every stare. He kept making music, dropped 2 more local tapes, stayed in the booth, stayed talking to young cats, always with the same tone, calm, direct, no lies, no sugar. He told kids what jail felt like, how funerals smell, what it means to lose your own brother to a street beef over nothing. He never acted like he was better than the block. He just made it clear he was tired of burying people. But Don's body was paying the cost of the life he survived. By 2003, he was in and out of hospitals, fighting infections, weight loss, complications the streets couldn't diagnose. Some folks said it was liver failure. Others whispered it was something else, but nobody ever really gave a full story. What mattered was, by the time his 30th birthday was creeping up, Don was already moving like an old man. The swagger was still there, but it came with a limp, and behind every laugh was a cough that didn't go away. In the summer of 2004, Don Gumby passed away. Quiet, no shootout, no drama, just a man barely past his youth, body worn down by a life most folks wouldn't survive half of. He died surrounded by family and a few homies, with stories untold, songs unreleased, and a legacy that never got the billboard but stayed etched into every block he touched. His funeral brought out everybody: rivals, old friends, teachers, local rappers, community organizers, cops who used to chase him, kids who only knew him through his verses. People cried, but they also nodded. They remembered. They respected. Because Don was real. He made mistakes, no doubt, but he never lied about them, never ran from them, never acted like he was anything other than a product of where he came from. Today, you won't find his name in rap history books, and you won't hear his voice on Spotify playlists. But in North Minneapolis and in every Asian American crew that ever felt invisible, Don's name still moves like wind in the alleys, quiet but heavy. They say legends are loud, but sometimes the ones who mattered the most were the ones who never even got to tell the whole story. Don didn't make it to 30, but every kid who picked up a mic instead of a Glock, every little brother who chose a beat over a bullet heard him, and they still do.